and welcome to A Slice of Mental Health. I'm your co-host Cara.
And I'm Tracy, Cara's mum.
And this is episode 1 in series 1, and we are going to be talking about stigma. And stigma specifically regarding like mental illness and struggling with mental illness and the way that you internalise it and the way that society makes you feel about it. So it's important to know most people experience stigma, and stigma comes in all shapes and forms and sizes, and it's not just in the mental health world, but we're obviously coming from that perspective. But in the mental health world, it's broken down into 4 categories. So you've got self-stigma, public stigma, professional stigma, and institutionalised stigma. And Mum and I today, our experiences is with the self and others. And we're going to talk about a bit about our experiences with it and how they make us feel and kind of how we dealt with them. I'm coming from the perspective of having been a teenager that was struggling with their mental health and the way that teachers and peer groups and sometimes parents make me feel about struggling. And then
and I'm going to be talking about I suppose the stigma that I felt towards myself really when I was growing up, and very much that generational, I think I've said, I'm in 55, so how it's changed, but how we didn't really talk about mental health or those emotions or what was normal. And then when I became a mum, how in actual fact the stigma that I felt towards myself became even worse really, and more difficult to navigate. But also really hoping that, having listened to our introduction, I was thinking to myself, I would have loved it if I could have listened to somebody who was going through some similar experiences, and it would have helped me feel less alone. So I suppose some of this is about helping people feel less alone, but never assuming that our experience is like anyone else. No. This is an experienced look, but it's our experience, and everyone will have differences on that, and that's why we'd welcome any comments and feedback and how it was for you.
And I think as well, we're coming from a hindsight perspective. So I am no longer a teenager that struggles with their mental health. I'm 24, I've kind of grown through that stage of my life, and this is me sharing what my lessons were from that, but no one's going to have a carbon copy experience. You might be listening as a parent who's got a teenager who's currently struggling and is currently in high school and is currently maybe getting bullied or going through the hormonal changes or just generally just struggling. I need to find a better word than just struggling, but you know what I mean? It's kind of that, growing.
Well, it is a struggle.
I
mean, I think you're using that word because it is a struggle, and that's often how it feels. It just feels like it can be a bit of a struggle, and you're right, we are talking from hindsight, so even our memories won't be completely accurate, so we're remembering it as we remember it now. In actual fact, I think it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to get across how difficult it was, because we probably couldn't have done this podcast back then because it was too difficult to do, and we're doing it from a perspective where we are both well. However, that doesn't mean we don't struggle, and that's about being human. So we certainly don't want to give the picture and stigmatise anyone else that you have to be a certain way to look like you're in a better place. Everyone's better place will again look different.
And when you're in it, I think back on when I was struggling with my depression, anxiety. When you're in that state, you're a lot of the time, for me, I was in a trauma response. So I was quite anxious a lot of time. My self-awareness wasn't as great because I was in survival mode. It's almost like that primitive part of my brain was just on all the time. So I never went into that calm, reflective point of view when I was in the states of anxious and scared and trying to get into school, and it was just survival mode, and I was just fighting all the time. So I wasn't thinking about really nichely, or when they said that to me, it made me feel like this, but I still had the response to it. I still, I used to get called I was too sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And I still maybe didn't understand, oh, this is why I feel like this when someone says I'm too sensitive, because it's their stigma and it's this and that and X, Y, Z. But it still made me feel like, oh, that's not nice, that's invalidating, it's making me feel like there's something wrong with me. And that's why our hindsight, we hope, is helpful. Because when you're in it, you don't always get to reflect as greatly until you're out of it.
Yeah, and I think it's about, we're going to use the word being human, but it's a bit like the word struggle. It's a way of trying to simply say that, we're going through kind of a process of change, and even if you don't do anything to find a better place, things change around you. Things are changing. You're either getting older, or you might change job, or you might have different relationships or different friends, so you're constantly changing. Even if you don't proactively say, I don't like how I'm feeling, and I don't like how I'm feeling, and how I feel other people are viewing me because of this. But we're here to talk about stigma, so let's talk about what stigma looked like for us. Do you want me to start, or are you going to come in with what stigma was like for you?
I think maybe start from my point of view, and then you'll have more to comment on, I guess.
Yeah, certainly.
So a bit of my backstory is I sort of started showing signs of a child that wasn't mentally well, probably around the age of like 7 or 8. And when I was in primary school, I was getting bullied, and part of the way I coped with that was I would be sick all the time. Like once, I constantly had a headache or a cold, or like something hurt. I had a sprain, I've got eczema. My eczema was sore. Like there was always something. And with that, I was able to go to the nurse's office, and this became sort of a routine behaviour of concern, where Cara's always sick, and teachers started viewing me as the sickly child, and they would use language like, oh, she's being attention seeking, and I'd hear, like, she's being attention seeking, or like, oh, Cara, you're just being a drama queen. And this type of language is stigma. And it's dismissive, and it's invalidating, and it's not looking at why is this child doing these things. Because I think if my teachers had gone, why is Cara constantly sick, they'd gone, well, we know Cara's getting bullied, and we know that what we know about children is that when children get bullied, they're quite vulnerable, and they're scared, and they don't really have the language to explain that, and they'll try and escape that some way. And that can be by being outlandish and confident and noisy and boisterous, or for me it was finding ways to get out of the classroom, finding ways to escape the bullying, and going and sitting in a nurse's office and being looked after and getting a chance to leave my bullies. And this was something that kind of went through my whole primary school experience, and I think having that stigma put upon me started to make me feel like there was no space in primary school for me to be unhappy and to be able to express my feelings, so I started to internalize, and I think that's when it started to turn into mental illness. Because at school I never felt like my mental health was being protected in the way that the teachers viewed me. They weren't thinking, bear in mind this is like the early 2000s, but they weren't thinking consciously that we shouldn't be calling this child attention seeking or lazy or sensitive, like too sensitive, because it's invalidating. And that's when, for me, I think it started turning into illness, because when you're unable to express yourself, and you don't feel you've got a safe outlet, you start to internalize it.
Yeah.
So going into like teenage years, so say you want to look at it like the seed was planted in primary school, and the sprout started around the age of 7, 8, and by the time I was 13, it was a fully fledged thorny bush.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is I started to behave like someone that's mental health wasn't good. So I started to self-harm. I developed suicidal ideation. I was depressed. I was anxious. I had disordered eating. And I say this even now, I can feel that little tightness in my chest because I look back and I think, God, so young to have all these labels. And it was really confusing. I almost felt I was too young to understand. You're this is a bit nerdy, but your frontal lobe, your frontal cortex is your emotional regulation center of your brain. That's not fully developed until you're 25. So to be going through all these feelings of like doubting your self-worth during 13, 14, 15, you're still so young. Your way of processing that is never going to be the logical, pragmatic, reflective, aware way that you do as an adult. It's going to be the, I don't understand, this is scary, I don't know what to do with these feelings, I'm 13, I don't have the language to express
why should
feelings.
You have the language? That's what we said about hindsight, hearing Cara talk so articulately about it now, but this wasn't language that a child should have to have, in all honesty.
But if we're going to allow bullying, and we're not going to do anything about bullying, we're going to have to give kids the language.
Well, yes, and you're right, I'm saying but we need the right kind of language, don't we, to be able to describe it. And I guess, as a mum, trying to navigate what was going on, so you can see that you've got a child who's struggling, and initially you are trying to build that kind of resilience because so there's a bit of it, what the real world's like, these things happen, it's not perfect, so that it's your job as a parent to bring your child up in a way that they can cope with some of the difficulties in life, like people might not be nice to you, they might say things but that is quite different from bullying, which is repeated and sustained and every day.
You almost can't counteract it.
And you can't counteract it.
Yeah.
So I think there was some stigma in terms of me thinking, well, we should be able to sort this out as a family. We should be able to build Cara into being maybe not so sensitive, because that was a word that we had been told. So there was that sort of going on. Is it our job?
Is it your responsibility as a parent?
Yeah, our responsibility. And if we don't get it right, it is my fault.
Yeah.
So that's the stigma. So we talked a bit in our introduction about the pressures on parents bringing up children just generally, whatever you're dealing with. But there is this thing still, and it's still there, that if your child is struggling in any way, it must be your fault. You got it wrong. You weren't good enough. And I suppose I should bring in, my kind of story and why I was stigmatising myself was because I was still on my own journey, and my reference point was I'm not good enough. And if your reference point for a lot of things in your world is I'm not good enough, then when you become a parent and your child struggles, you are stigmatising yourself because you're going, my child must be struggling because I am not good enough. I'm not good enough as a parent.
I guess when you're in that mindset, did you sometimes forget or not feel that other people also will have an influence on your child's growth? Now I feel like I'm learning a lot at the moment about how your peer groups and the people you associate yourself with impact your mental health and your psychological development. So I guess for you as a parent, you were trying to battle with Kara's also being exposed to bullies and being exposed to bad adult leadership. So like my teachers, they weren't validating. But I guess when you're, like I'm asking you, like I guess when you're a parent, you don't think about the external factors that could be upsetting your child. You think, oh, it's me. Like you don't think, oh, she's not developing resilience because of X, Y, Z. Oh, it must be she's not developing resilience because I'm failing.
Well, I think we're talking only personally. So we were absolutely sure that you were being bullied. So we first of all were very much about supporting you to cope with some of that to start with. No, so we didn't know you were bullying, so that's different. No, we knew you were struggling, so we were trying to support you. But then when we realised you were being bullied, we then went to the school for help. So we went and asked them for help with that. My view at that time was deal with the bullies and Cara will be okay. Yeah. I didn't think, she's too sensitive, she's this, she's that. I thought she's in pain and hurting because girls are being really horrible to her on a daily basis. So that's a bit about that human emotion. Your response was very normal. To go to the sick room, to try and escape what was going on, to get some one-to-one adult attention where you were safe.
Yeah, well, I just had a thought there as well. Like, I think, obviously, I can't reflect on the time before me, but I certainly think my age group is the first where it's probably the last age group where teachers and caregivers weren't mentally aware. I think the classic one is like, in the school I remember seeing it branded everywhere, like the golden rule, which is treat others how you want to be treated. And if I was to rephrase that word, it would be empathic. Like, think about how you feel when someone does something to you, and don't do it to them. So when someone says that you're ugly, don't say to other people that you're ugly. Like, be empathic. And there was always that in the school, but I never felt like my teachers were empathic. And that shows in the language that they use, the dismissive, dehumanizing language that they use. Like, to say it to sensitive, well, I now view that as, actually, I'm an empath. Like, I felt feelings, and I still now feel feelings really deeply. And it was my response to being bullied. And I just feel like that's changed. I think that is different. I worked in a nursery for a while, and I feel like people were just a little bit more, like the practitioners were aware of how you don't dismiss a child's feelings, whereas I feel like my age group was potentially... Do you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Like, I think I was potentially the last one. I think it's not perfect, but I think it is different now. I think teachers are a little bit more aware. And certainly as I became an adult, I mean, I had one teacher when I was in high school who was just amazing. You know exactly who I'm talking about. And he was just fantastic. He just got it. And I'd credit him, I'm not going to say his name, but I'd credit him as part of the reason why I started to get better. Because he didn't have stigma. He didn't look at me as this like teenager that was just like difficult. He understood mental health. He understood the mind and what the mind does when it's under stress.
And so what we're moving into a little bit is about what helps as well, aren't we? We're talking a bit about what actually helped us. And I suppose the things that we know that have changed. So when we talk about your teachers, they were they were older than I was. So we're talking about, this intergenerational trauma. So if we're talking about people that were, maybe 20 years older than me, mental health was just not talked about, unless you were sick and in an asylum, let's use the stigma word, but if you were So nobody would confess to having a mental health problem or illness. You would hide it.
But even if you knew you had it, I think that's part of
Well,
education wasn't there. Like,
yeah.
Education wasn't there when I was in primary.
Yeah.
There was none. Like I've spoken to some parents now, and like it sounds like in schools they do have like mental health education. Like in the nursery we had like a self-regulating corner, which was like you could point to a picture and be like, this is how I feel, and like, you know, I feel like this and that. That for me is like, God, I wish I had that when I was a child, because it wasn't just like happy, sad and angry. It was like feeling guilty, feeling distressed. Like it was like the language was so much broader than I was ever taught. And, you know, certainly my internalized stigma, which was that of I don't fit in. As a teenager, I started to feel like I don't fit in. I'm not good enough. I'm not, like I'm unlike others around me. Like I'm broken. All these kind of like really nasty views of myself changed as you started to sort of validate and give me the language to communicate those feelings. So the feelings had already occurred because the stigma had already been put on me as a child. It was already, she's too sensitive, she's seen the drama queen, this, that, and X, Y, Z. But when you started to help me have language, like the classic one mum gave me, and I treasure this, is when I was younger, I used to say at school, this is like a 7-year-old, but this is language, right? It's like, I used to say at school, my heart's all broken in little pieces, but when I'm at home, it's full. And I was a child saying, like, school makes me feel shitty and distressed, and at home I feel safe, and thank you for making me feel safe because you created a safe space where my feelings are validated. And yeah, I think that helped.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot about how it's changed through the generations and why it's probably been very difficult to be a parent, and we're talking about how things have improved. We're talking about how sometimes we can't solve the problem. So we couldn't solve the bullying, we couldn't, you know, get that to stop, unfortunately. And we did move your school in the end, which I think helped. But that what we're saying is if somebody is saying, I am feeling whatever they are feeling, we need to be listening to that, because that breaks down the stigma. You know, it rather than labeling it with language that isn't helpful. It is about, if somebody's feeling that, then they are feeling it, and it needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah, I think just you saying there, like labeling it with language that is helpful. I feel quite passionate about this, but also not labeling it with medical language.
Yeah.
So if someone's showing anxiousness, it doesn't mean they've got anxiety and they need that label, because I personally felt as a teen having like diagnoses that didn't help, because then I was now a teenager that I felt like I had these secrets, and I was put on medication. I started citalopram when I was 14, 15. You'll remember better.
Yeah, this is what we're saying. It's a bit blurry, but so, yes, it was about that age.
So like I felt like I was this teenager that had a diagnosis. I mean, I even had someone try and diagnose me with BPD, borderline personality disorder.
Yes.
After a car, like do you remember that?
Yes.
After a lorry accident, I was 17, and said, "Oh, have you ever thought that you might have BPD?" And I spiralized with that, and I went on this big thing and started like putting every little behavior of myself against these symptoms.
Yeah.
I don't have BPD.
No, you don't.
You know, I don't. I'm sometimes unregulated, and I sometimes was attached to people. Yeah. But so I felt like I had anxiety, like disordered eating, depression, all these really big, heavy medical model diagnosis language on me. And then I started medication, which in my opinion, and this is my experience of it, did a lot of no good, just made me worse. And because of that, like stigma as well, like being on medication, I stopped taking it. I wouldn't take it all the time, which obviously doesn't help, which is probably why it made it worse. So like all these like things and labels, it just made me hide even more. Whereas I think if maybe the more holistic approach had been applied to my feelings via medical professionals, which is you struggle with anxiousness, you have a trauma response, you know, they're less treatment, diagnosis, treatment, cure. You know what I mean? Which is like, that's the medical model. It's like there's a disease to cure. Whereas it's more, these are part of the ways that you handle stresses, and you know, it's okay to have these feelings. It's just, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or am I rambling?
You're not rambling, but I am.
There's a thought process there.
I am very aware that this is a slice of mental health, and when we started this, we'll just share with you how the process of trying to prepare for a podcast. So, and when I did it, I went, I don't think if we can talk for 20 minutes about this, and I've realised we've talked easily for 20 minutes.
But it's still a slice in comparison to most podcasts. We're only at 25 minutes.
We're talking about, stigma, and we probably could do another episode on stigma, because you can't talk about this without thinking about all the different layers that contribute to these sort of feelings of, feeling stigmatized or stigmatizing ourselves, or trying to understand. I'm back to this word, trying to understand what it is to be human, So, and then when you get that label, so you're right, Cara, when you got the label of borderline personality disorder, oh my goodness, I
didn't get a diagnosis. It's just a comment.
It was a comment. It's like, oh my goodness. And then you're reading about it, and that's the other thing that I think is really interesting in this world where we are, and I think it's really good we're talking about it in the way we are. So, but also is that there's so much information out there now that we could almost label ourselves with everything, and how helpful is this? And again, just to remind you that we are talking about an experienced look, and we're not mental health specialists. Cara's trained to be a mental health nurse. I have a nursing and a coaching background, so some of that informs the way we talk and the way we share our experience, but it just shows you how complex this is. But if we really get down to the nub of it, is that there is stigma, there is shame attached to that. But what we're saying is we're trying to have a courageous conversation that opens it up to other people. And what we're saying to you is be courageous and have conversations with each other, your family, your loved ones, and try and find the dialogue that helps you kind of live your complex kind of life. So I think
we need to talk about the little things that we did.
Yeah. Just
wrap it up. Don't worry about time. We're still learning how to do this. And I think, I think it's not advice, but what worked well for me. And whether you are someone in your 20s reflecting on if you've got a similar story to mine, or you whether that be you're someone that's been bullied, or you struggle with your mental health, and you still struggle with it maybe, or you struggle with this internalized stigma, or you're a teenager listening, or you're a parent, anyone, whoever you are, and this resonates a little bit. The thing that helped for me on my recovery journey is taking that power back and practicing empathetically toward myself. So saying things like, you weren't wrong for not functioning at your best whilst you were a teenager. I say, like I think I said in the intro, but like I never got to learn how to be resilient because I never got the chance to learn that. These are things that you learn at such a young age, that because I was being bullied, I never got the chance to do it. And I've now learned how to be resilient, and I'm very good at protecting my mental health world, like space. And I've taken the power back, and one of the things, I will talk more openly about this in future episodes, but my self-harm scars, there's so much stigma around self-harming, and there still is now. And people view it as this really, I think it makes people like shiver inside at the thought of hurting yourself. But I was so ashamed and made to feel ashamed about using self-harm as a way of dealing with my big emotions, that I would hide them and I wouldn't wear anything that I felt comfortable in. Or I never dressed particularly femininely, long sleeves, that kind of classic example of a teenager hiding scars. That I've taken that power back now, and I have my scars out, because I might not be able to change everyone's perception on self-harmers, but if anyone looks at me and sees them and goes, oh, well, you know what, well, she's wearing shorts, and they can either think, oh, she's being attention seeking, or they can think, good on her. That for me is my little micro way of taking back my power of the shame that I experienced for being ill, and also maybe changing people's perceptions of what self-harmers look like. I think people are shocked. There'll be people listening now, and this is part of the vulnerability of doing this podcast, but who will go, God, no idea. I wouldn't have thought it. So yeah, taking back the power, like sort of making claim to what you struggled with, be practicing empathetically, and setting boundaries with people that make you feel ashamed or stigmatized for having feelings. If you feel like anyone, if you get that feeling of going, actually, that wasn't a nice thing to say to me, I came to you feeling vulnerable and you dismissed me, set that boundary. Actually, I don't think you're good for me, I'm not going to see you anymore, or I'm certainly not going to come to you with my vulnerability. You're a friend for this, which might be going out for drinks and dinner, but you're not my friend for going and opening up myself vulnerably. Yeah, true. So that's what I did to kind of move forward with the stigma I experienced.
Yeah, and I guess, again, probably too much at this point, but I had to learn to reframe that I was good enough. And that is a daily thing that I have to do around different things, but it is that self-empathy and actually reframing rather than looking for what you're not good at or what you're not getting right, and particularly as a parent, all the things because I couldn't fix what was going on for Cara at that time. But as she's got older, her being able to share what has worked and how good her home life was, and that we did the best we could, has really helped. So that has helped. So it's a journey. It's a journey of your own self-care to get to the point that you reframe things and look for what you're doing right, not what you're doing wrong. Yeah. And it doesn't really matter whether that's at work or being a parent or anything else. But again, I think that's something we'll talk more about that process and that journey of discovery.
But I think, stigma's always going to exist.
Yeah.
And I think as long as we're aware that stigma is always going to exist, we can practice that self-empathy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed. If you're still with us, you hear that slight insecurity. Go, God, why people don't listen? Yeah. We are up on YouTube, and at the moment we're on Spotify, so this will be where you're listening. So if you want to subscribe to us and turn on your notifications, our next episode will be out in a week, and that episode is going to be on what is mental illness.
So thank you for listening. Yeah. This is A Slice of Mental Health.